12th, 2017. It's 10 a.m. It's my pleasure to call to order today's meeting of the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance Board of Funeral Directors and Embalmers. Ms. Lisa Bohannon, will you please call the roll?
Dennis Bridges.
Here.
Mark Hawthorne. Robert Davis. Jeff Duffer.
Here.
Robert Helms.
Here.
Clark McKinney.
Here.
Charles Rahm.
Here.
Mr. President, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Bohannon. First item on the agenda will be to adopt the agenda.
Move to approve the agenda. Second.
Got a motion from Mr. Rahm, second by Mr. McKinney. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Agenda is approved. Next item will be the minutes.
Motion to accept the minutes.
Second. Got a motion from Mr. Duffer and second by Mr. Rahm. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Legal report, and today I think we have Mr. Tony Gandorf to help us today.
Thank you. Good morning. Now, I can't remember, does the attorney usually read them for you all?
Yes.
Okay. I was planning to do either or, and I could not remember. So we'll go ahead and read through these. On a couple, I may try to do an explanation before I read and then read. Sometimes it's difficult to put a story in paragraph format, so we'll try to get there. And if you all have any questions, please feel free to stop me as we go along here. So the first 5 items, for the first 5 items that we have, 1 through 5, I won't read out those numbers here, but they're all the same. They're all in the same funeral establishment, and they are all during the same incidents or occurrence here. So the complaints involve the state, the conditions of the establishment during the funeral of a deceased loved one. The complaints all allege that the establishment was not properly cleaned, including the presence of insects and rodents in the establishment. Complaints also allege that the air conditioner was not working, and the establishment was very warm, uncomfortable. Further, the complaints allege that the bathroom was unkempt, as the trash was running over and the sink and toilet and walls were visibly dirty. Complaints provided pictures of the disheveled restroom. The complaints also allege unsatisfactory service by the establishment, which included tardiness of the funeral director, who they allege had been napping in the back office prior to the service, which he was found doing by family members. Also allege that the traffic services were not provided as agreed upon, and a family member had to direct traffic as a result of this. In response, the respondent contends that the funeral home was clean during the service and all meetings with family members. Although the respondent admits that its air conditioning was not working, it was attempting to fix the issue. I don't think I put this in here, but the service was in June of last year, which, as we go here, an investigation was conducted and obtained sworn statements from the complainants which substantiated the claims regarding the lack of cleanliness of the restroom along with the lack of air conditioning. It was also found from these statements and from the response of the respondents that a member of the funeral establishment staff that had met with the family to conduct the arrangements had done so without first obtaining a funeral director's license. This individual has already been subject of a previous legal report regarding this issue and has been sent a consent order for discipline for that activity. However, what has not been addressed is the funeral establishment's activity in that. Additional information for consideration, but I don't believe necessarily is relevant for your determination of this violation, is that the respondent has stated that the respondent has filed a civil suit against the complainants since the complaint was filed to collect the funds owed for those services, which have yet to have been paid. And the lawsuit was filed after this complaint was submitted. My recommendation for the items that we can substantiate is authorization for a consent order amount of $1,000. Plus investigatory costs, and that is for an unclean restroom, not in good working order, the lack of sufficient air conditioning, and also for allowing an unlicensed individual to arrange funeral details, which would be aiding and abetting an unlicensed.
Motion to accept council's recommendation.
Second. Motion by Mr. McKinney and second by Mr. Rahm. Any other discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Next, please.
Thank you. And gentlemen, the next few items that we have on here, 6 through 15, is going to all relate to. It's going to be two separate complaints, all relating to the same funeral establishment, the same manager, and the same employee. I've tried to break them up the best I can to relay the story, but to put them all together would be very difficult, I think. So what I'll do first is I will relay the first complaint story of 6 through 8, and then from that we'll talk about the employee at the funeral establishment, and then we'll go on to the second complaint. But I may change that up as I go, but I'm going to try to kind of convey this to you the best that I can. So on 6 through 8, there are 3 complaints here by different individuals, all who were subject to the same incident. So they all filed separate complaints. That's why we have 3 of them. It's against the same funeral establishment. The complainants all allege that there was one main complaint, and everybody else was with her. So I'll tell this from her perspective. She visited a respondent for a quote with the cost of her mother's funeral. A representative of the respondent met with the complainant along with her brother and informed her that she would receive a quote on Monday. That would be August 26th. That's an error in my report. Not necessarily necessary, but to go along. So they would receive a quote. It would be on a Monday. She visited on the 26th, and she had her brother with her and some other persons. Her brother, she contends, signed some paperwork that they believe was in order for them to obtain a quote. So the story is that, here, you have to sign this, I'll give you a quote. But when they left, they did not have a quote. So on Monday, which would have been, August 28th, sorry. The respondent informed the complainant, so they checked back with the respondent. The respondent informed that they had picked up her mother's body and already had embalmed her, which is the subject of the complaint. The complaint says that they were surprised from this information, that she was only expecting a quote, not an actual service. The complainant decided not to use the respondent's services, and this, I believe it had to do with the price, the total price of what it would be. So according to the complainant, the respondent refused to release the body of the deceased until they were paid $1,075. The next day, the complainants had met with and chose a second funeral home and attempted to pick up the body and was refused. The complainant contacted the respondent again, was told that now it would cost $2,175, which must be paid for the release of the body, which included an additional $500 consultation fee and $600 for what was quoted as just prearranging. The respondent, they stated that the complainant and her family initially signed the authorization for removal and embalming form on Saturday, August 26th, and received a quote from the funeral home costs on Monday, which would have been the 28th, at which time the complainant informed respondent that other members of the family of the deceased would be paying for the services. On Friday, September 1st, another funeral home contacted the respondent inquiring into the cost for transfer to their funeral home. The other funeral home stated that it would only pay for the embalming and removal services, despite respondent's submission of itemized costs for the transfer. On Tuesday, September 5th, the respondent alleges that the respondent states that a representative of the other funeral home, the family in Memphis, that would have been the complainant. The complainant told us that a representative of the funeral home to pick up the mother, the family, the Memphis Police Department, and the media all showed up at respondent's facility and demanded release of the decedent's body. The respondent here stated that that the police were satisfied that no laws were broken on demonstration of a signed authorization form, and that the family paid the itemized costs in the amount of $2,175 by a cashier's check. I believe it was from a different member of the family. They signed the release, and the decedent was released to the other funeral home. Our investigator noted that there was actually no executed agreement for goods or services in this matter found whatsoever. So we don't know what that signed authorization form is. We don't have that. 2 other family members filed complaints alleging the same as above. So that's how we have 3. Our investigation found that the individual who operates the establishment, who made arrangements with the family, who refused the release of the body, and was the sole person that had met with the family, is not a licensed funeral director and previously held an apprentice funeral director registration, which expired in August of 2000. It was also found that the manager of the funeral establishment, the registered manager, lives 220 miles away from this location of the funeral establishment and is also the manager of a second funeral establishment in another state. Okay, and so my note here is that 12 through 15, number 12 through 15 will be the second set of complaints. So let me just kind of recap, if I can. I'm sure you all read that. Is that the largest issue is that they believe they did not have any signed authorizations, no signed for any services, that the prices that they were quoted changed throughout the process. When they contacted the second funeral establishment and attempted to pick up the body, they would not release the body until the full amount was paid. I believe the original $1,075 was for the pickup and the embalming, and then after after that, it increased another $1,100. So that is where we're at, and all of the whole time, this was, their only interaction was with an unlicensed person. So the only person in the building was this unlicensed individual and a secretary, I believe. They never, with this complaint, ever talked to the actual funeral director manager of the establishment. All of this went on without them. So if I can hold off on the authorization and go to number 12 through 15, we'll skip 9 through 11 because that's going to be on the individual. 12 through 15, same funeral establishment, same individual unlicensed working there, different family, and same manager. This transaction happened just a few days after this one we just talked about because it has to do with the media, the media and what they saw on the TV. So these complainants, the complaint was actually submitted by a competitor who is another funeral establishment in that area. And essentially, without reading this first, I'll tell you what the facts are, is that this individual, a woman died in Arkansas, was transported to a funeral home in Arkansas. She was eventually picked up by this same funeral establishment. The family members were contacted. The family members had met with this unlicensed individual, and they saw the news story on the media, and they said, we do not want this funeral establishment to deal with our deceased. So they said, we would like to use a different funeral establishment. This is the one that filed the complaint because they attempted to pick up the remains, and they said that they wouldn't release them until they paid $1,200. There's no signed documentation as to anything on there. So I'm assuming this is probably for a pickup and also the embalming at the same time. So this funeral establishment complainant who complained spoke with the actual funeral director manager who wasn't on site, and states in their statement that we need to be able to work this out. The media is here and it's going to get kind of bad, and they appeared not to be concerned about that. So this family contacted an attorney. They worked with the manager and the individual, and they actually paid $900. Happen, though they did refuse to make the release until anything was paid, and there was no documentation whatsoever that they had at that point in time. The complainants state that the unlicensed individual came to their house 2 times, and they went to the establishment several times, and throughout all of that, no documentation is available on that. And that's what our investigation found. There is a statement of funeral goods and services that were obtained from the documentation, but it's not signed by either party. Okay, so that's the second one. So based on these 2 complaints, these set of facts that we have right here, the fact that the person was unlicensed, they had solely dealt with these families, refused to provide any, the release of the bodies when requested, no signed documentation, the increase of the fees, the fact that the funeral director manager is 220 miles away from this location and wasn't present at the location for any of this that we know of, we're recommending revocation of the funeral establishment's license, number 1. Second, recommending revocation of the managing funeral director's license and that person's embalming license. From what I saw from the facts of this, I don't understand how a funeral director could actually manage this location, being 1 state away, 220 miles, and the only other employee who's there is a secretary and an unlicensed individual who is clearly contacting families, clearly making the arrangements, clearly filling out all of the documentation on behalf of them, and then appears to not actually understand exactly when someone is required to release a body to a family or whatnot, or how to deal with those issues. So based on that, I feel that this is, and I have it listed, on number 6 through 8, the actual violations that we have for the funeral establishment, which would be aiding and abetting of an unlicensed funeral director, failing to be managed and supervised by a licensed funeral director since they're actually not at the location, and more unprofessional conduct, permitting unlicensed person to engage in the profession of funeral directing and refusing to surrender the custody of a dead body upon the express order of persons legally entitled to such. Further violations include misrepresentation of the services to be provided, unreasonably refusing to promptly surrender the dead human body, and for failure to comply with the provisions of the chapter. Also for treating the public and not treating the public in a respectful manner regarding failure to surrender the body, and engaging in unfair and deceptive practices as defined in the funeral rule, and acts that are misleading or deceptive, and that would have to do with the further services that were requested and that were actually paid for in that. As to the funeral director, the revocation was based on the fact of for failing to supervise, manage the location, for aiding and abetting an unlicensed person in the practice of funeral directing, for unprofessional conduct, misrepresentation, deceptive acts, and violations of Chapter 5, Title 62. Also to note is that the establishment's funeral director / manager is also a partial owner of the location. The funeral establishment itself, I don't believe, is owned by them. The physical location, it's owned by another company. And I have spoken with that landlord in the past. It's previously been a different funeral establishment. So I'll give that to you all for consideration at this time.
How did the complainant respond to all these charges? I mean, did he deny them? Did he?
The respondent's response?
Yeah, my bad, the respondents.
We have, well, we have the respondents, it's the individuals, we have their affidavit as to the transactions that went on there. So they responded in detail. I don't think there was a denial of failing to hand over the remains. It's actually a very detailed affidavit. It has times and locations that were in there. Starting with I went and picked up the body at the hospital, took them back, and whatnot. So it's very detailed as what they were doing. Let me see. I think
There was no denial of any of the charge?
so there's not a denial. Making sure that there wasn't a substantive denial as to those facts.
Seems like him living so far away, he shouldn't have been allowed to have been the manager.
One of the things that they say about the individual who's unlicensed is that essentially that person is an operations manager, and so they try to use his role as some type of operations manager to justify a lot of the unlicensed activity that he was doing. But the definition of a funeral director includes operations in many aspects, and so that was part of the response. Part of their defense, I guess, would be that technically what he was doing wasn't funeral directing, but of course we take a different position. Right.
On the on the second set of facts that I gave you, so the unlicensed individual's affidavit indicates that when he talked with the family, they indicated they wanted the other funeral home to pick it up, that they were not going to pay for the services, and at that time, it was his understanding that they were dealing with the actual that the family was speaking with the actual licensed funeral director manager back about 3 days later and paid the fee. So he's basically and I think that's what we had said earlier, is that there was an attorney involved, and they did come back and make a
Board's recommendation as far as revocation of licenses, is that until the formal hearing, that would just be
Yes, sir. There's not a recommendation to make an action effective today, that it would be through, we would negotiate that with them. We would indicate that these are the basic facts. We would express to them that basically the way that they are set up, there's not a, based on these facts right here, this is egregious actions that they have. And then going forward, their model of having a funeral director manager who's 220 miles away, who's not actually there for at least these transactions and potentially other transactions, is not something that can withstand, going into the future. And so we would say we ask that you just voluntarily revoke and give up your own license. If they don't do that, then we will have a hearing on it, and we would come before you all with a hearing as to that. And then you all would have a second opportunity, based on the facts that you all hear, if anything changes or whatnot, because these are large stories, is whether you wanted to revoke a license or suspend or civil penalties at that time. So I fully expect that may be the course that goes. Usually on these matters, that from what I've read through the investigations, the fact that their business model is set up as they have somebody who is operating, as Sherelle said, who's actually doing the arrangements, meeting with families, that person is picking up the individuals from the hospital, taking them back, and is that I don't see where the actual funeral director or the manager is involved in any of this, so far as the families are concerned. So that creates a risk of harm to the public that I think that can't really be. There's no support out there that we have. I think it could perpetuate, and so instead of waiting for more of these types of complaints to come forward, my recommendation would be to go ahead and seek a revocation of a license. There would not be not similar, no license change right now. Right now would be just going forward. It would be either they voluntarily gave up their license, or we would have a hearing on it.
I'll make a recommendation, or a motion that we accept council's recommendation.
I'll second.
Motion by Mr. McKinney and second by Mr. Ron. Any discussion or any questions? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. Next, please.
So I will go to numbers 9 through 11 right now, which we skipped those in the middle. This addresses the unlicensed individual. Based on the two scenarios that I provided further previously on this, I'm recommending authorization for a civil penalty in the amount of $2,000 plus an investigatory cost, and that would be $1,000 per incident with one family and then a second family against that individual who is unlicensed.
I'll make a motion to accept the council's recommendation.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Duffer and second Mr. McKinney. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Next, please.
We're on my page 6, number 16. Here, a complainant alleges that she arrived at the cemetery for her spouse's burial service, and the burial site was not prepared correctly, that the hole was dug too shallow, and allegedly the respondent informed the complainant and her family to leave and return about an hour later, and the problem would be corrected and they could watch their loved one be buried. When the complainant returned, she alleged that the respondent had already buried her husband, filled the grave, and left the cemetery. The respondent responded and contended that the complainant did not purchase a grave site setup, and it was agreed. He admits that it was agreed that the final committal would be done at the funeral home. However, that the family could attend the burial if they wished. The respondent states that they realized that the grave was too shallow and discussed the matter with the cemetery personnel, and the cemetery personnel suggested dismissing the family while the situation was remedied, which I believe they had to make the hole larger. It was in between two other grave sites. Until the situation was remedied, and include making the hole larger, placing the casket in the grave, and covering it. Respondent alleges that he explained the situation to the family, told them that they could come back in an hour or so to see where their loved one was buried. So their response was he recognized that he agreed that they could be at the burial side when they put her husband in the ground, and then he does say that yes, they did say that she could come back in about an hour later, and asked them to be dismissed there is a little contention as to whether or not what was told, that you can come back in an hour to actually view us putting the casket in, or whether or not it would be, this is where you're going to be at. So, but since I'm sufficiently satisfied that there was a conversation that the family expected they would be coming back to watch them lower him into the ground. So due to that, I recommend authorization for a formal hearing and to settle this matter by a consent order with a civil penalty, an amount of $500 for unprofessional conduct.
Motion to accept recommendation.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Rahm, second by Mr. Duffer. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Next, please.
Gentlemen, number 17 was based on an inspection, and you have a list of six items that that were the results of an inspection of a funeral establishment, and I'll read those here for you. The first, number one, was that the respondent charged $495 more than the price list on the general price, than the price listed on the general price list regarding the price for a package offering for one decedent. The respondent contends that this was an error, and the price respondent actually charged the family was less than what the general price list indicated. However, we didn't find that through the inspection. Number two, the respondent did not provide a completed statement of funeral goods and services selected at the conclusion of arrangements demonstrating the itemized charges during the funeral arrangements of one decedent. The statement of funeral goods and services selected in the decedent's file was completely blank except for cash advance charges for obituaries and copies of death certificates. The respondent contends the family only owed for the cash advance items and they were not charged for a service charge. Number three, the description of items included in the package offerings of the statement of funeral goods and services selected did not match prices listed on the general price list. Further, the listing of the statement of funeral goods and services omits the words basic and staff from the listings of package prices as required by the funeral rule. Number four is that one casket on display in the casket selection room does not appear on the casket price list. Further, that one casket in the display room is advertised for sale was $100 more than listed on the casket price list. Also, the casket price list describes one casket as velvet lined, but in the display room it is on display with a crepe interior, not a velvet. The respondent avers that this was a typo, which has been corrected. Number five, the prices listed for caskets on the general price list does not agree with caskets listed on the casket price list. Further, the GPL advertises $250 for a low-end range casket, but this price does not represent a casket, but it's actually for an alternative container. And number six, the name and address of establishment is not listed on the general price list, the casket price list, or the statement of funeral goods and services selected list. And the respondent contends that this also has been corrected. Based on these violations and given their history, we recommend a consent order of $750.
Motion to accept council's recommendation.
Second.
Motion by Mr. McKinney, second by Mr. Duffer. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Number 18, please.
Okay. Number 18, this was an anonymous complaint that was sent to our office that attaches in advertisements where employees of respondent funeral home are listed are listing in advertisements with the acronym NLFD after their name. Anonymous complainant avers that this is not a legitimate state license and it is misleading to the consumers. The respondent stated that the acronym NLFD stands for Non-Licensed Funeral Director and is present on advertisements to inform the public that certain employees are not licensed funeral directors. Nevertheless, the respondent states that the NLFD labels will be removed from future advertisements and attached an advertisement with the title removed to show that to us. The anonymous complaint further alleged that the licensed funeral director of the respondent listed as the manager of the respondent is also the manager of two other establishments. The respondent contends that it has since hired a new manager who only manages that one establishment. Our recommendation is for a civil penalty in the amount of $250 and require the funeral establishment to properly report and pay appropriate change of establishment manager fee to the State Board office.
Motion to accept recommendation.
Second.
Motion, Mr. Rahm, second by Mr. Bridges. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries. Next, please.
Number 19. I'll read this, and hopefully I won't get confused, but I want to tell you that our recommendation at the end would be authorize a letter of warning regarding the failure to provide a copy of a general price list. It's just that one issue, but I'm going to go through everything that was part of that complaint so we get a fair analysis of it. The complainant alleged that the funeral home failed to provide him with a statement of funeral goods and services selected and did not give him a copy of the general price list at the conclusion of arrangements. The complainant further alleged that upon requesting a copy of the contract, the prices had changed drastically. The contract shows several items crossed out of the overall price, and that the overall price was lowered. The complainant further alleges that he was wrongfully charged for an alternative container. The complainant states that a special urn that the deceased had made was used. The complainant stated that he wanted to place the family member's urn in the same crypt as another deceased relative and was told he would be charged the exact same price as another crypt and was not offered a second right of interment or entombment. The complainant alleges that after filing the complaint, he received a call from the representative of the funeral home accusing him of being a thief, and etc. Both the statements from the complainant and the funeral home confirm that the complainant did cash out an insurance policy but has not paid the bill for the services provided at this time. The complainant states that he was instructed to file the claim but does not explain for failing to pay any monies that were owed. The respondent alleged that the contract was initially not complete and they were waiting on additional pieces of information to complete the contract because the customer had to withdraw the insurance funds before the arrangements could be finalized. The respondent alleges that the current contract was changed when the complainant changed his mind regarding certain things. The respondent alleges the complainant knew he would be charged for an alternative container and that they do not place multiple bodies or ashes in the same space. The contract that we found that was provided to us shows that originally the complainant was charged for basic services of a funeral director, use of facilities and staff for a funeral, viewing, visitation, and transfer of remains. All of these charges were subsequently changed, and he was only charged for use of the facilities and staff for memorial, resulting in approximately a $1,900 reduction in the bill. The contract is signed by the complainant. The contract itself does not show a merchandise charge for an alternative container. The respondent states verbally that the discussion about the alternative container deals with the total price for the direct cremation, and the complainant does not understand that there had to be a container in which to do a cremation itself as opposed to placing the decedent directly in the furnace. The only merchandise charge is for acknowledgement cards. This is on the contract. The use of a contract that clearly delineates the charges along with the complainant's signature shows the agreement in terms of the contract. The complainant's statement that the prices were all changed due to a clerical error when he asked for a copy is countered by his signature on the agreement and the funeral home's contention that he changed his mind after requesting the insurance funds. The complainant hasn't provided us with further evidence to show that he was not given a copy of the agreement or that the general price list was not used. However, it appears that a copy was not given. Upon review of the general price list, it is determined that the complainant was charged the exact prices on the GPL at all times. The complainant's subsequent complaints about being contacted by the funeral home regarding his outstanding bill and alleged rudeness is countered by his failure to pay any outstanding bill despite there's being an insurance funds for such, and it's difficult to substantiate those. That's why our recommendation here today is authorization for a letter of warning regarding the failure to provide a copy of the general price list.
Motion to accept council's recommendation.
Second.
Motion by Mr. McKinney and second by Mr. Duffer. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Next case, please.
Gentlemen, the next case is they're on the report is number 20, 21, and 22. They involve one funeral establishment, one individual who is a funeral director in that same individual's embalmer license. Here, the complainant alleges that his minor nephew, who was 17 years old, was approached the night his father passed away. Was approached by an employee of the funeral home at the hospital and provided a business card and instructed to contact the funeral home in order to make arrangements. The complainant was so upset by this that he went to the funeral establishment the following day to inquire about the solicitation. His visit has been confirmed by the funeral home. They did state he came. The funeral home denies this incident occurred and highlights the fact that the business card was never brought to the establishment as requested for inspection. The complainant states that instead of returning to the funeral home after he was denied, after they denied any wrongdoing, he decided to file a complaint with our office. Because complainant had to look at a list. The complainant had to look at a list involving pictures. So he went to the funeral establishment. And they showed him pictures of everybody who worked there, and he identified this is the person who was there. had to look at pictures in order to identify the person he believed was responsible for handing out the card. It does raise concerns about the proper identification with our office. Nevertheless, there's compelling evidence on the solicitation on behalf of the funeral home did in fact occur. The complainant states that we have not seen the copy of the business card. After the respondent responded, he sent a supplemental document in stating that his wife has the business card. She had it with him the day that he went to the funeral home, so he didn't have it with the name on it. But states that he positively identified the individual. He saw, and he states that there's a second witness who was also at the hospital who saw this transaction occur with the 17-year-old nephew. Based on that, we recommend authorization for a civil penalty in the amount of $1,000.
Motion to accept the recommendation.
Second.
Got a motion, Mr. Rahm, and second by Mr. Bridges. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Next case.
Thank you. The next case involves number 23 and number 24 is a funeral establishment and a funeral director. Here the complainant alleges that a respondent agreed to refund money to a customer after the decedent's life insurance policy was found to be in good standing, however, that the respondent failed to refund the money. The respondent admits that they owe the money to the consumer, but states it has not been paid back because they did not know whether to pay the actual person who made that payment on their credit card or the actual beneficiary of the life insurance policy. The only reason the consumer paid via credit card is because it was unclear whether the insurance policy was in good standing. The establishment received full payment from the insurance company, so the monies to the consumer should have been immediately refunded. In our opinion, the establishment should have sought legal advice if they had a question about how to do this, because essentially they responded back to us with that question. Our recommendation is authorization for a consent order against a funeral establishment amount of $2,475, which is triple the amount owed to the complainant. If the complainant is issued a full refund, which was an amount of $825 by cashier check within $30, recommend reducing the civil penalty to $1,000. And you will see that based on this history of this establishment is why it's at that amount of $1,250. And for the funeral director, authorization for a consent order and a civil penalty amount of $250.
Motion to approve recommendation.
Second.
Motion, Mr. Rahm, second by Mr. Bridges. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, gentlemen. This concludes the legal report.
Thank you, Tony. Next up will be the director's report, Mr. Robert Gribble.
Thank you, Mr. President. First is a legislative update. We have not received any official notification from the Tennessee State Funeral Director and Mortician Association, the Tennessee Funeral Directors Association, or any related parties of any legislative proposals that they intend to pursue during this next legislative session, which begins next month, January 2018. Licensing report, only 2 establishments. Either reported licenses administratively approved by the Executive Director pursuant to Board authority for the period of November 14, 2017 through December 11, 2017. A new establishment in Chattanooga and a name and location change in Memphis. Name and location change in Memphis was done before it was done. I had consulted with the board president. Some determination as to whether or not that establishment should appear before the board, but after consultation with Mr. Helms, we moved to go ahead and approve that name and location. Closed establishment report. There are no establishments that have reported closing since the last board meeting. Disciplinary action report. This is a report of consent orders that have been administratively accepted and approved by the Executive Director pursuant to the Board authority as reported on the October 2017 Regulatory Board Disciplinary Action Report. And lastly is a complaint report. As of yesterday, there were 26 complaints open in the funeral director and embalmer profession and 51 complaints opened in the licensed establishment profession. for a total of 77 complaints. Mr. President, that concludes my report.
Gribble, do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
A motion, Mr. McKinney, and second, Mr. Duffer. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Do we have any licenses, applications, Mr. Gribble?
No, sir, not today.
Okay. Next item on the agenda will be the election of board officers for 2018. First item to decide will be the incoming president.
I will make a motion that we place Charles Rahm as president.
Second.
Got a motion by Mr. McKinney and second by Mr. Bridges. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Mr. Rahm, congratulations. Next item will be the vice president for 2018.
Mr. President, I'd like to make a recommendation that Mr. Jeff Duffer be placed in that.
Got a motion by Mr. Rahm to nominate Mr. Duffer for vice president, second by Mr. McKinney. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And motion carries as well. Mr. Duffer, congratulations. I think our board's in good hands for 2018. Next item will be the continuation liaison for 2018. Discussion or recommendations? Typically always helps Mr. Gribble if it's someone that's closer to Middle Tennessee.
President, I recommend Mr. McKinney.
Second.
Got a motion for Mr. Clark McKinney to be a continuation liaison. Motion was made by Mr. Rahm, second by Mr. Duffer. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Any new business coming before the board today?
President, I'd just like to thank you on behalf of the board for your service the last 4 years, and especially this past year as president, and appreciate you and thank you for the fine job that you have done serving the state and the session.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure serving with you, and we'll miss you.
Well, the state's well represented. We've got a strong board, and I feel good with who's here, and I appreciate being able to serve with you guys and the staff, and Mr. Gribble and his complete staff. It's been a pleasure, and I thank you all.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion, Mr. Duffer. Second by Mr. Rahm.